In this podcast episode, Morgan Housel dives into America's mounting housing crisis and its devastating ripple effects on society, economy, and politics. He explores how the current generation is grappling with unaffordable homes and increasing inequality, the psychological and economic mechanisms behind these issues, and how historical precedents shed light on potential future outcomes. The conversation also touches on inflation, debt, populism, trade wars, and the cyclical nature of politics and economic crises, offering nuanced perspectives on navigating uncertainty. Morgan outlines how housing unaffordability affects young people far beyond just their ability to settle in a home. Not being able to buy a house statistically correlates with lower marriage and fertility rates, rising substance abuse, and deteriorating mental health. Housing is often the milestone that signals adulthood, and when that is out of reach, many feel trapped in an extended adolescence, an emotional and social suppression with wide-ranging consequences. The shortage of affordable homes inexorably pushes some into homelessness, which in turn fuels drug crises, among other social problems. He stresses that unlike many complex economic issues, the housing problem is fundamentally a matter of supply. The U.S. is simply not building enough homes, despite having the resources and demand to do so. Decisions by politicians, regulators, and communities to restrict building, often influenced by NIMBY, attitudes and protection of home values, exacerbate the crisis. Morgan explains how rising home values create a false sense of wealth among existing homeowners. While many feel richer as their property values double over the years, they haven't truly accumulated wealth unless they sell and buy a cheaper home or downsize. The uniform rise in housing prices means homeowners' gains are illusory. This creates a damaging dynamic where the interests of older generations preserving high home values conflict with younger generations' need for affordable entry points into homeownership. This artificial scarcity, fueled by restrictive zoning, inflates costs and wealth inequality across generations. Homeownership is one of the few assets that many individuals understand and emotionally connect with. Unlike abstract financial markets, houses represent a tangible, long-term investment that benefits from compounding appreciation over decades. Morgan highlights that the compounding effect on homes held for long periods can generate substantial wealth, reinforcing the importance of affordable housing access for younger people. Policies targeting investors buying up houses are largely symbolic and insufficient. Meaningful solutions require loosening regulations and vastly increasing supply rather than merely stimulating demand or controlling prices. A significant barrier to housing supply growth is the regulatory environment shaped by political incentives and community opposition. Morgan discusses how regulations have swung so far that building the most basic asset, homes, has become nearly impossible at scale without navigating costly and slow processes. This regulatory capture benefits a small group of well-connected developers who leverage barriers to entry, reducing competition and innovation. A more open system encouraging entrepreneurial approaches, such as 3D printing homes, and eliminating arbitrary hurdles could unleash new supply and reduce prices. The current setup inadvertently preserves wealth for older homeowners at the expense of younger generations. Morgan links housing instability to broader societal ills, including alienation from politics and community. Renters often feel transient and politically disengaged, whereas homeowners develop a deeper stake in their localities. This shift partly explains the rise in extreme political views as younger generations feel like tourists in their own cities with no ownership or belonging. Social media amplifies this by exposing younger people constantly to lifestyle comparisons, intensifying feelings of inadequacy and decline amid growing inequality. The lack of affordable housing deepens this divide and diminishes social cohesion. The discussion shifts to the broader theme of inequality, emphasizing that some degree of inequality is natural and inevitable due to differences in talent, cultural strengths, and geography. However, toxic inequality arises when disparities become intolerable, fueling widespread resentment. History shows this cyclical process culminating in social upheaval, revolts, or reforms. Morgan points to the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II as a period when society confronted runaway inequality and chose collective investments in housing and infrastructure, ultimately lifting a generation. Today's stagnating housing affordability, combined with rising debt and social division, risks repeating this dangerous cycle unless addressed. The podcast explores inflation's role as a man-made phenomenon linked to government budget imbalances and money printing. Inflation erodes the value of money, often inflating asset prices and benefiting those who own assets disproportionately. Morgan highlights how assets, and particularly housing, drive the K-shaped economy where a small percentage owns most wealth, leaving the majority behind. Younger generations often lack access to other financial assets like stocks and rely heavily on homeownership as their intuitive wealth-building vehicle. This dynamic, coupled with increasing debt levels, propels inequality and political polarization. Morgan critiques current political approaches that focus on stimulating housing demand, such as lowering interest rates or down payment assistance, rather than addressing the pathogen of constrained supply. Symbolic measures like banning large investors from buying homes do little against the fundamental shortage of millions of units. He explains the political difficulty in tackling supply problems because it requires long-term thinking, overcoming local opposition, and accepting possible short-term adjustments in home prices, none of which are popular with voters or entrenched interests. Reflecting on history, Morgan draws from the post-World War II era when America rapidly built millions of homes to accommodate returning soldiers through entrepreneurial efforts like Levittown. This massive supply response was driven by market incentives and fewer regulatory hurdles, demonstrating that mass home construction is possible when political will aligns with economic opportunity. Today's tangled regulatory systems, community opposition, and political incentives have locked the country into a housing shortage that stifles social mobility, especially for young families. The conversation explores how student loan debt has burdened millennials and Gen Z, limiting their ability to invest in housing and build wealth. Morgan calls the student loan system evil in its indiscriminate extension of massive debt for degrees regardless of value, burdens that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. While necessary from a lender's perspective due to the difficulty of recovering loans from young, asset-poor borrowers, the result has been a distorted demand cycle and skyrocketing tuition. Despite this, household debt as a share of income is relatively low today, largely because fewer young people can afford mortgages and many avoid credit. Morgan and the host discuss the risks posed by America's rising national debt, historic debt-to-GDP thresholds beyond which nations often face internal strife and economic collapse. Unlike individuals, countries can carry permanent debt as long as growth exceeds borrowing costs. The U.S. benefits from still dominant dollar reserve status, but faces challenges from declining currency dominance, rising global competitors like China, and shifts in geopolitical power. The political tensions and trade conflicts currently observed are seen as symptoms of this shifting and uncertain world order. Morgan stresses the complexity of forecasting exact outcomes, but warns that history offers examples of both catastrophic decline and muddled endurance. The podcast highlights that economic and political turmoil are not unprecedented. Morgan points to past eras like the Great Depression and the 1970s as examples of intense societal upheaval followed by recovery. He argues that politics naturally swings between extremes and that current polarization and populism are part of known cycles. Although social media and modern information bubbles have intensified division, the mechanisms leading to self-correction remain. The seeds of future stability are often planted during the worst crises as public demand shifts toward practical governance. Closing on a philosophical note, Morgan advises embracing humility and preparing financially for unknown risks beyond those on the horizon. He recommends maintaining high liquidity and low debt to weather unpredictable shocks, acknowledging that surprises historically cause the most damage. He encourages living in the present and accepting uncertainty as a permanent feature of life, contrasting the false reassurance of attempting to predict or control the future. History, he says, offers perspective and reassurance that humanity has faced and overcome crisis before.